Well, hey there, students. It's Mr. V. This video is going to be a companion video walking you through the workflow on how to render spheres. Now, spheres are very common, even though we don't see them very often, because in most living things or rounded surfaces or forms that curve away from you, light reacts in a very similar manner on them as it does on a sphere. So whether you're rendering like living things or if you're painting and rendering, artificial looking things, we need to understand a couple of factors. First of all, what is the light doing based on the form of that object? And then two, what are the materials and how's that going to impact the light? So you see here we have like a brass reflective type surface. And then on the other one, we've got a matte surface, which means it does not really reflect. It soaks all the light up. I always teach my beginners how to render a sphere first, so they really get an understanding on light direction. And so this video is going to cover that workflow for the most basic beginner lesson. So the first thing I have you do is I have you download a 8.5 by 11 inch sheet, which is just a graphic. So we've got white of the paper. We've got this ellipse that shows the ground plane of this form. We've got 6 different spheres, and we have a matchstick with the actual light source on top. So the workflow that you're about to see is the most bare bones, diluted down workflow that I see across many different digital painters. So we want to work in a manner where we use layers, where we use our tools and our layers in such a way that we can go back and make corrections. We call that non-destructive editing. And we want to work with blending modes. So the first thing I want to do is make a background that is grayscale. And so let's pretend you just opened up your file. You'll make a new layer. I'm going to put that on the very bottom of the layer order. And then I'm going to use my paint bucket tool. And I'm going to choose a nice mid-tone gray. The reason we do that is because it makes it easier for us to see the values. And if I turn off that top layer that was the form that I imported, now you can see we've got our bottom layer. That's the background. So the first thing I'm going to do is lock it so I don't accidentally paint on it. And I have a leftover layer over here that I'm just going to delete. And so now turning on our topmost layer, which is our sheet, this would be equivalent to your line drawing if you brought in a line drawing on white paper. Well, we don't want to have the white pixels visible, so let's get rid of that. To do that, I'm going to select what's called a blending mode. Right now it's set to normal. Blending modes make layers see-through, and there's all these different blending modes. I'm going to select multiply. Multiply makes only the black pixels visible. Now I'm going to do one other thing, and I'm going to take the opacity or opacity, however you say it, of that layer, and I'm going to turn it way down so that the line art is nice and ghostly in appearance. I don't want the line art to be too bold, otherwise I have a hard time seeing my painting. And now I'm finally going to lock that layer. So you should have 2 layers visible, background and then your line art. Let's start with the silhouette or block-in layer, as I like to call it. So we work with selections a lot of times, and I'm going to be painting this completely with the mouse, just so you see that you don't need a drawing tablet with some of these basic geometric forms. If you are using selections, then you should be golden on this. So this new layer, I'm going to call it, let's call it silhouette. Okay, just the outside of a thing. And so I'm going to use a couple of tools. For starters, I've got my rulers visible. If you can't see your ruler, just go to View, make sure that ruler is checked. And now if I use my cursor and grab from the ruler, I can bring these guides down. And these guides are very helpful. You can get it from the top ruler and from the side ruler. So this is the purpose of this is going to help me render this sphere out. So let's put a ruler guide right on top of the sphere, and then let's put one right over here on the left side of the sphere. And it creates a little intersection. I'm going to go over here to my marquee tool, and I'm going to select a little boxes in the way, elliptical marquee. And then I'm going to place my cursor on this intersection. I'm going to hold down Shift to keep the proportions constrained, and I'm going to draw that circle right around the shape of my sphere. That's going to give me a mask so that I can just paint inside of this. So what this does, we referred to this earlier in our fruit exercise. If we were going to paint something, it keeps everything within that selection. These marching ants can be a little annoying, so if you want to shut them off, just hit Command H or Control H. Now it's still an active selection. We're going to exploit this. So for your silhouette layer, to make it easy for selections, you would just use your paint bucket tool, select a midtone that's slightly darker than your background, and then, or lighter, or slightly lighter, it's up to you, and then drop that little fella in there. Now I'm going to deselect by hitting Command D or select, deselect. And as you can see, it's letting me paint everywhere. The reason we do a silhouette layer is because it makes it easy to extract our painting from the overall piece here. So if I hold down, if I select my magic wand tool and I make sure that my layer is currently highlighted that I want to make the selection of, clicking on it will select the sphere. Another thing that you can do is if you have multiple spheres and multiple elements that you want selected, holding down Command and clicking on the thumbnail of the layer you want selected will select everything on it. Does the same thing. So I'm not going to mess with this silhouette layer. I'm actually going to lock it, and I'm going to keep that locked until I need to add more spheres. So just for the heck of it, let's add a couple more. So add our little line, our little guide, and then put our guide over here. Marquee tool, holding Shift, and we've got our next sphere. Drop it in there. If you want to get rid of your guides, just hit View, Clear Guides. And let's get another one right up here. So let's get one for this top sphere. They're all different sizes. Some are bigger than others that are closer. Get your marquee tool, hold down Shift, and then bam, drop it in. Let's clear our guides. And now, as you can see, if you want to select all of them, just Command click the thumbnail and see they're all an active selection now. So let's say that that's as far as we're going to get. I'm going to lock it, and let's move on to lighting. Our light source is this matchstick right in the middle. I'm going to make a brand new layer. I'm going to call that lighting. And we're going to use a standard 1, 2, 3 read on these spheres. Please review my other videos on how to make a 1, 2, 3 read, how it works, and what the anatomy of a sphere is. There are a couple of them on my YouTube channel that you'll need to be familiar with, and we have already covered at this point in class. So the workflow for a professional generally is to work off of a silhouette, and then in a new layer, have your lighting based on that. So I'm going to use my magic wand, select this closest sphere. I'm going to now click on my lighting layer, and I just want to hide the selection. I'm going to use a soft edged brush for this exercise. And because our lighting is right here in the middle, we need to figure out where our tangents are going to be, where the edges of our sphere will lie. So we're going to have an edge right over here. And then we need to think, you're looking at the grid, what side of the grid is the side of the sphere? And that would actually put the edge of the sphere about here. Okay. So using our other light ray, we'll draw through. And we're going to have both tangents here and here. So our core is going to, actually, because this is backlit, our core is going to look like very disc-like, very round. And then the top is going to have mid-tone and then some of the bright areas. So our light will look like a crescent. So with this selected, let's get rid of our lines. I'm going to grab my lighter value, and let's choose the neutral mid-tone value of this sphere. The dark color that I chose was, just to help me with selections. It's not the true color. All right. So by painting in here, let's choose a light range. We'll say it's going to be light gray. Let's drop it in like this. And now let's get our core shadow. So how do we know how dark to make it? If this is the true value, then halfway to black will be about here. This will be how dark our core shadow is going to be on this object. So now let's turn down our brush, and I'm going to start to paint in the core shadow where it impacts on both of those tangent sides. I'm going to gradually build up until it crosses the terminator, and I get to 100% value. So now we've got 2 values in here. We need 3 in order for it to read. So I always tell my students in general, if it's not looking like you have those three values, turn off your line art and let's check it. So we have a light gray, which lands about here. We have our middle gray, mid-tone, which lands here, and then our core, which falls about here. So this is a very light valued sphere. You want to be mindful of that, how local value impacts it. And I have a video called Halfway to Black, the half to black formula that's used to calculate that. Okay, so we have our 1, 2, 3 read. Now we need to look at bounce and rim light. So bounced light, I have a separate video on that again. You want to review that. So I'm going to make a brand new layer for the bounced lighting. I'm going to call it bounce. And I'm going to sample the natural mid-tone value of it. And I'm going to see where that falls. And then let's sample the ground. And we're going to fall darker than its, mid-tone range and lighter than the ground. So that means our bounce should be about here in this range. I'm still working within a selection. See? So using a big fluffy brush, you're not going to see the bounce very clearly because it's very weak. I'm going to use low opacity and start to paint that in on the opposite side of the light. And you see we're not seeing much here. It's very dim. But once we move on to our next step, which is the cast shadow, the bounce will start to show. So new layer. And by the way, you can do your cast shadow first and then do your bounce if you want. It might help it to become more visible. I'm going to call this cast shadow. That's what grounds the form. And that is going to go underneath the sphere in the layer order. I'm going to deselect now because you don't need to have a selection active when you're doing this. I'm going to select quite a bit darker value range, right? And I'm going to turn my brush way down. And then I'm going to start to paint in the cast shadow that would be cast. And that's a little large, so let's back this down a little bit. Follow the angle where the light is. So the light is above, behind, and to the left. So that's going to create a slant that's going down to the right. And then gradually build up value in this area. All right. So your contact shadows are going to be quite a bit darker where light gets trapped in your core shadows. And I think the contrast is actually pretty weak on this sphere. And so one thing that you could do during production is to go back to your lighting layer and maybe give it what's called a levels adjust. Levels adjust is you hit Command L. And what we could do is bring up this left arrow a little bit to darken the core shadow a little bit. And that gives a little bit better contrast, I think. And so then I would sample these value ranges for the remainder of these spheres over here. So let's double check what we've got. Here is our bounce right about here. It's a little bit big. So what I'm going to do is get my soft edged eraser and push it back. I'm going to erase out some of that bounce a little. And this is one of the reasons why you want to work in such a way where each major lighting step is its own layer. Beginners oftentimes put all of their layers together when painting. So with bounce in its own layer, we can also go over here and turn the opacity up or down to control the brightness of it. That's very helpful. We can't do that if it was all on one layer. And so now that we have bounce, I'm now going to do what's called rim lighting. So let's go rim lighting. You can also consider this kind of a highlight. And so rim lighting samples from the light source. And the light source is going to be like a bright sun, like pure white. And so I'm going to dim it a little bit, bring it down about 10, 20%. Because as the light hits the surface, it's going to be diluted. Like when sunlight hits an object, it's not as bright as the sun. The sun is the brightest element, right? So with my rim lighting, I'm going to work on a selection now. So make sure your selection is active. So on my silhouette layer, get your magic wand, make sure it's selected. Go back to rim lighting, hide your selection because it can be irritating. Then with a soft-edged, low opacity brush, maybe 20 or 30%, I'm going to start to paint in just on the edges an area that is a little bit harsher. And if you want a crisper edge, shrink your brush down a little. So before, after, before, after. Give it the zoom check, starting to read. Let's turn off the line art and let's see what the sphere looks like. And so far, the render is holding together for a very basic sphere shape. So we would continue doing this throughout the entire piece. Also, if you notice, this is symmetrical, meaning the left 3 spheres are in the exact same position mirrored for the right 3 spheres. So I did that on purpose to teach you a production shortcut. So in production thinking using digital, we want to make the best use of our time. I would not recommend rendering each sphere individually. Render one, and then let's clone the sphere, flip it over, and then put it in place where its little twin brother would be. You would do that for each of them. So you could finish all 3 on the side first, and then just clone the whole group, flip it, and move it over. Here's how you would do that. So I would shift-click all the relevant layers, going from cast shadow all the way to rim lighting. I would duplicate those. And then one of these is locked, so I'm going to unlock that. Let's go back and make sure that the relevant layers are clicked. And then now I'm going to flip it. So I'm going to go to Edit, Free Transform, or Command T. And you can right-click on here and hit Flip Horizontal. Using your Move tool, just move this over, hit Return, and you see how we've moved them and cloned them. It doesn't look like I lined my lines up perfectly symmetrical, but we will eventually be deleting the sphere render anyway, the line art, when we place it down. So now let's look at presentation really quick. So there's a couple of things that we need to do. I'm going to define a sky and a ground plane. Then I'm also going to define the light source and the spotlight. So before I do any further things on this, I'm just going to put my sphere into a folder. So just shift-click those, and then click on the folder icon, and it collapses them into a group. That just helps me stay organized. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to. As a matter of fact, maybe I won't right now. So let's first define the sky. So the ground is going to be the brightest because it's reflecting the light. The sky is actually going to be pretty dark relative to the ground. So I'm going to use a low opacity hard-edged brush. I'm going to also make a new layer, Mr. Verzat. Let's do that. So new layer on the underside of everything. I'm going to call this sky. And you can shift click this. Get a straight line. That's a little bit low, so let's go a little higher. I'd like to have the ground plane underneath one of the spheres so that one of the spheres can kind of peek up over the edge. There we go. And then for the ground plane right here, what's going to happen, let's make a brand new layer, and I'll put that underneath. I'm going to call that ground. We can fuse the sky and the ground together if we want to, but the ground is going to be lighter than the sky, and as the ground recedes away, it's going to get dimmer. So I'm going to select a lighter value than I currently have for the ground. I'm going to use a soft-edged brush, and then that brush I'm going to set at a lower opacity. I'm going to just do a quick little pass to make it kind of transition in that manner. And I'm not really going to touch the sky or the ground anymore at this point, so I'm just going to fuse those 2 layers together. Just shift-click them and hit Command E, or you can right-click and go, let's see, shift the 2 and go Layer, Merge Layers. Command E is the shortcut for that. And so now let's paint the light source where it's coming from. It's going to be a spotlight matchstick. So I made a new layer. I'm going to call that light source. For every major step, I'm going to go bright, hot, white. With a soft-edged brush, turn the opacity of the brush down to like 10%. Let's put a little blob. Now I'm going to shrink it down a little bit. shrink it down, shrink it down, and build up a bright little pin light. It's very, very bold here. Now, if you want to fade those in together a little more cleanly, then you can just sample some of the values and then grab in between and feather them a little bit more. All right, let's get a nice hot center in the middle. All right, now I'm going to put a spotlight effect on the ground that we're going to have. So I'm still going to use that light source layer that I'm on right now, just for convenience. You could do that in a new layer if you wanted to. If you wanted to, just put it underneath the light source. And I think I will do that. I'm going to call it Spotlight. And having sampled the brightness of that spotlight, I'm going to turn my brush way down and I'm going to illuminate this area on the ground around it. It's going to get heavier as it gets closer to the center. All right, so we got a nice spotlight effect. And then finally, maybe we'll put on our light source a thin little sliver showing this, showing the little twig that it's resting on. Build up a few layers of that. All right, and now let's turn off the line and let's see what we have. I like that sliver that we've got, so let's kind of keep that. All right, fair enough. And you see we've got a render. I'll probably clean up my spotlight a little bit better. It has a really ugly hard edge to it. And so remember to do that, we just play with brush opacity. I'm going to grab the outside edge, turn it down a little, and then feather those edges in a little bit. You can also use what's called a blur effect. So if I step backwards, you go to Spotlight, and you go to Filter, Blur, and give it a Gaussian blur. And controlling the edge of that blur makes it completely disappear. But by playing with the blur, it softens that spotlight look. So we would continue working on each sphere in this manner. And so it's very important that we review our layer order here. So in general, remember, we work off of a silhouette layer. So we make selections. We then would apply our lighting. And then for any major step, all right, the bounce will be its own layer so that we can control its opacity. Rim lighting would be its own layer so we can do the same. The light source itself obviously would be its own layer. And then the sky and the ground, you can fuse those together and then add like a little spotlight effect down there. Final finishing touches we reviewed a little bit earlier was adding a levels adjust. So to our lighting, if you're feeling that the contrast is a little bit weak, you can go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, or Command L is the keyboard shortcut. And by playing with the left darkness slider or the right slider, you can increase the brightness and the darkness. We do that oftentimes at the end, but you can also do that on individual layers. You can do it to the entire piece or individual layer themselves. And so I would say, hey, it's a good adjustment here. I don't want my core shadow to start getting darker than my contact shadow, my cast shadow on the ground. So those are some fundamentals you just want to be mindful of. Maybe we need a little bit more brightness, or maybe it doesn't work. We could cancel that out. So that has been a review of the basic workflow on rendering a sphere, some of the techniques that we consider, layer management, and some of the tools. If you can render a sphere, you can render anything. If you can manage this basic workflow with your layers, then after you've mastered that, then there's all sorts of different ways that we can work in it. But this basic workflow really helps beginners to separate each step of the process and make it manageable. I hope you found this helpful, everybody. I look forward to seeing you guys in class. Take care.